when you craft access to information laws, this presumption needs to inform the drafting. It needs to inform the language used in the legislation, the text of the law. Unfortunately, there are instances I indicated earlier. There are instances where access to information laws are used to actually undermine the right. This is when presumption is not in favor of disclosure. This is where presumption is in favor of secrecy, as we see it in, for example, in Zimbabwe on the NAmibia, as we see it now in the South African proposed protection of state information bill. The third point, with regards to exceptions. Remember, I did say, while we recognize that this is a right, a basic human right, it is subject to certain limitations. I know that my colleagues in the open data movement will disagree with that, wherein there's a call for everything to be made open. But those of us who have been working in this area for a bit of a while will recognize, will accept that there will always be limitations on the right of access to information. And those limitations are built in the text of the legislation itself in the form of exemptions or exceptions to the right. This is when you now say that there are certain circumstances and conditions wherein access may be limited. And earlier this morning I mentioned the issue of privacy, I mentioned the issue of national security, for example, or even trade secrets. You find that in a number of other regional instruments like API, for example, or even the current draft African model law on access to information, there is this recognition. You do have a body of exemptions that are built in order to protect legitimate interests. Governments should maintain and preserve records. You will note that when we speak about access to information, the traditional laws, such as the South African law, there is reference to a record. While people are talking about access to information, they're actually talking about access to a record. While I think in the more progressive laws, such as I think the Nigerian law, it speaks about the right to information regardless of form or medium. I think that is the case. Definitely it is the case in the African model law, the African Union's model law on access to information, where the right relates to access to information, whether or not it is recorded down in some form of a record. What this recognizes is the importance of records management to the whole issue of access. Because if there's poor access, there's poor maintenance of records, there's poor records management systems, then that limits the ability of the citizen to access the information. So records management is critically important. The last one relates to the refusal of access, wherein the law minister is saying refusal of access must be only based on provisions provided for in the legislation. So whenever you are refused access to information, the grounds for the refusal must be based on the law itself, and you must have the right of appeal through an independent review mechanism. So those are some of the standards or the norms that were proposed in the Commonwealth system, and I think they are widely accepted. Karen mentioned earlier the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, particularly section Article 9 of the Charter. And then we have, following the adoption of the Charter in 81, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights went on to elaborate, to give elaboration on the article itself through the Declaration of Principles of Access to sort of freedom of expression, which included a part on access to information. And this was adopted in 2002. So the Declaration contains principles of freedom of expression, but there is, within those principles, there is a section on access to information. And this is what the African Commission is saying. It says public bodies hold information not for themselves, but as custodians of the public good. And everyone has a right of access to information. Now, a number of African countries have struggled with this issue of everyone having a right of access to information. If you look at the South African law, everyone has a right of access to information. It means you can either be a South African or a non-South African, it doesn't matter, you have a right to information held by the South African government. However, other countries have sought to limit this right to citizens. Now, I'm not going to prescribe which norm or which standard is appropriate, but I think these laws need to be crafted based on the needs of the country, based on the context of the country. I think in Nigeria it ended up being limited to citizens. No, it was
Everyone.
Everyone. Because I remember the government wanted to limit it to citizens. So you will find, as you engage with government in this issue, you will find that there is an interest to want to limit it to citizens. And a number of us are saying, you know, this should be a right that is enjoyed by everyone. What is interesting about the declaration from the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is that it has expanded, or it has extended the right to cover not only publicly held information, that is government information, but it also has extended it to privately held information. Now this is quite interesting in the sense that not a lot of other countries or other jurisdictions have done this. There's been a tendency to limit the right to information held by government. But in terms of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the right is extended to include privately held information. Other countries across the world have also done this, like Antigua and Barbuda, and South Africa, amongst others. Consistent with the Commonwealth principles, there is a clear recognition that the right and its exercise needs to be subjected to some kind of independent review whenever a requester is not happy with the response that they been given by the holder of the information. Most importantly, and this is consistent with what Graham mentioned earlier, the whole open data movement, that the African Commission in this declaration is saying that governments must publish information as much as they can, even in the absence of a request. That is what open data is about, putting information out there, making it available to citizens. Because you understand our context in the African situation, where a number of people will not have the confidence and the ability to step up and approach the government official and demand information. Therefore, it is important to promote this automatic publication of information, or what is called proactive disclosure of information. And the African Commission recommends that. And we had earlier remarks about whistleblowers, people that raise concerns about fraud or corruption wherever they see it. One of the principles that are being upheld is the principle of protection of those that disclose information in the public interest. So your access to information legislation needs to provide for such protection. Now lastly, as I indicated earlier in the morning, that secrecy laws or laws that violate the right of access to information, they need to be amended or repealed in order for them to be brought within compliance with freedom of information principles. Now, if you say Namibia, you still have the Protection of Information Act, I think the African Commission would advise you to amend the legislation to bring it within compliance with these principles that I have mentioned. In South Africa, they have attempted to do this, that is the government, but unfortunately what they have ended up with is an amendment that will actually do more harm than good to the right. So those are some of the principles from the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. They are also currently considering adopting what is called a model law on access to information. The model law will also contain similar principles as I have mentioned above. So those are the ones that I really wanted to talk about, and I will invite colleagues to make comments or ask questions or either Karen, myself, or Graham before we close for lunch.
This one is for you. Assange, Julian Assange, he is now on the director of Ecuador Embassy in London. Now, the United Kingdom is also part of this Commonwealth. So what do you say about that?
Wow, that's a question that I was hoping to avoid. Okay, let's talk about the situation that Europe and the United Kingdom are finding themselves in with regards to issues of access to information. It is a pity and a joy to say that Europe today and the United Kingdom are not the best exemplars on the issue of access to information and transparency. The apartheid that Karen mentioned earlier, a lot of us are hoping that apartheid, the African Platform on Access to Information, will one day be converted by the AU to become a binding legal instrument, like some kind of convention on access to information. I'm not saying this is a decision that has been made. I'm just saying some people would like to see that happen. They would like to see apartheid being this kind of guiding instrument in access to information. Europe has something similar. There is the EU Convention on Access to Information. I wouldn't advise you to follow anything that is contained within that convention, because it's very limiting on the right of access to information. A number of government officials that we deal with on the continent, they say, oh no, we are doing something about freedom of information. Our officials went to the UK to study the British system. And I always cringe, because the British freedom of information law is not a good example. It's not a good freedom of information legislation. There are more lessons to be learned from the developing world in terms of this issue. You want to look at Jamaica, you want to look at Mexico, you want to look at Brazil, Nigeria, you want to look at India, and unfortunately there's very little that you can draw from that will be progressive from Europe. I think particularly it's the EU structure, how it works. I think that the deepest cut on issues around access to information in Europe happened when they adopted the EU directives on privacy. Because European governments tend to look at those directives instead of looking at international norms and standards promoting access to information. Only recently, Germany adopted a federal access to information law. Only recently did France adopt a similar legislation. Spain doesn't have an access to information law. So whatever is happening in Europe, I'm not surprised by it, because they are not leaders in terms of transparency and issues such as those.
The last one, you just talked about Europe, but American journalists are having a problem with classified information. Because myself, as a American educated person, we were always told how free and fair and available information is and so on. But nowadays, the American journalists, they are saying they are tired of information being classified. So can you please explain to us what is classified information and why are they doing it like that today?
Okay. Classification of information in the US. The US adopted their Freedom of Information legislation in 1966. And over the years, a number of administrations have taken from it. A number of administrations have improved on it. I think the most improvements have happened under democratic presidents. And the most limitations have occurred under Republican presidents. If you start from Nixon and the Watergate scandal, moving on to George W. Bush with the Patriot Act, which limits to a large extent a lot of the rights that people had in terms of access to information. A lot of people had hoped that the Obama administration would would improve things, would change the situation around, particularly because of some of his executive orders that he issued when he became president, 2008. But there are challenges. I think they are keeping up with what is happening elsewhere. In the US, for example, in terms of the FOI legislation, they didn't have an information commissioner. They didn't have a federal information commissioner until 2 years ago. While countries in Southeast Asia, in the Americas, have had these structures for a long, long time. So, in terms of classification basically, it's what it is. It's a method of limiting access to information based on the sensitivity of a document. So there are various categories of classifications. Top secret, confidential, etc., etc. Now, what we are saying is that the classification of documents tends to happen on arbitrary grounds, where an official can simply stamp a document confidential or top secret. I've had instances, for example, in Tanzania, walking into a government department where there is a person who is employed to cut newspaper clippings about that specific department. So when this person reads a newspaper, they see something about the department, they cut the story and put it in a file. The file is then stamped top secret. You know, this is what happens. It's the arbitrary nature of deciding what is top secret, what is confidential. What we are saying is that classification decisions need to be based on exemptions in an FOI legislation. So you need to connect the two and not have a dual system or parallel system where information would be classified confidential in terms of the classification system, and it may be classified as publicly available information in terms of FOI. There needs to be harmonization of those systems. Again, that's another thing that we have to happen here in Namibia. As we consider adopting an access to information law, that we should also look at creating or calling for harmonization of the access to information regime with what is currently existing in terms of classification decisions. I know that Graham said, you said you are not aware of the Protection of Information Act being used to limit the exercise of journalism. I'm not sure in terms of Namibia, but I know that we have the same law and they were passed in the same year by the same apartheid government. And in South Africa, the Protection of Information Act is used as a basis for classification decisions, wherein they adopted the law in '82 and adopted regulations much later. And those regulations are about what can be classified and what cannot be classified. So at some point, we need to be moving towards a common area where there is harmonization of those two instruments. Edith?
Yes, thanks. I wanted to first of all highlight something that Bukelani, I think, alluded to, the importance of these principles. Now, as your process evolves and you're having a debate about what kind of access to information legislation you should have, a lot of these principles are going to be at the center of that debate. It's very important that you understand the principles and the issues, because the media would really be where a lot of the public debate would play out. And if there is inadequate understanding of these principles in the media, you would find a lot of very smart government officials that would do a lot of misinformation, turn things around. And if you're not yourselves adequately enlightened about these issues, you can easily be misled. And I've seen that happen a lot in many countries. So it's very important that you understand the principles and what the correct approach should be in relation to the freedom of information legislation that you are aiming for. I also wanted to respectfully disagree with Bukelani's response on the issue of Julian Assange. I know it's a deeply controversial matter, and I want to venture a personal opinion. First of all, I think Bukelani was perhaps too broad in his reference to Europe as not being a leader on access to information.